sound of gentle, melodic Japanese music mixed with the distant rumble of artillery. Archival black-and-white footage flickers on screen. Japanese women, some holding babies, look out from behind barbed wire. Their faces show a mixture of weariness, fear, and defiance. It's a story told in shadows and whispers, a chapter of World War II history rarely opened. The popular imagination paints a stark picture: the brutal conflict in the Pacific, the ferocity of battle, and the tragic fate of soldiers. But for a select group of Japanese civilians caught in the maelstrom of war, their story was not one of suffering at the hands of their American captors, but of stunning, almost unbelievable relief. They were mothers, daughters, and grandmothers, evacuated from the Pacific battlefronts and interned in American prisoner-of-war camps. These were places that, by all accounts, should have been sites of dread and despair. Instead, they found something astonishing: a sanctuary. They arrived expecting the worst, prepared for hardship and cruelty, only to discover a world of comfort, safety, and an abundance they could never have imagined. For them, the American internment camp was not a prison. It was paradise. Sound of waves crashing gently on a tropical shore. The air is thick and humid, filled with the buzz of unseen insects. Visuals: a serene panoramic shot of a lush green Pacific island. The camera slowly zooms in, revealing a small coastal village. The war came to Saipan not with a roar, but with a whisper, carried on the salt-laden breeze. For generations, this island had been a quiet jewel in the Mariana Archipelago, a place of tranquil beauty where the rhythm of life was dictated by the tides and the sun. But by 1944, that rhythm was shattered. The encroaching shadow of the American military loomed larger each day, a palpable dread that settled over the Japanese inhabitants like a heavy fog. Most of the civilians were not native to Saipan. They were Japanese administrators, farmers, and business owners, sent there to colonize and cultivate this far-flung corner of the empire. They lived in a bubble of imperial propaganda, a world where Japan was invincible, its soldiers a divine force, and surrender an act more shameful than death. Among them was a young woman named Kiyomi Sato. She was a school teacher, a quiet and observant woman who found solace in the simple routines of her life, tending to her small garden of radishes and daikon, teaching children to read and write, and listening to the distant, distorted radio broadcasts from Tokyo. Kiyomi had been on Saipan for 5 years, arriving from Kyoto with her younger sister, Hana. Their parents, staunch believers in the Emperor's divine mission, had sent them to Saipan to do their part for the greater cause. Their lives were Spartan but disciplined, governed by a rigid sense of duty. They believed in the official narrative that the Americans were savage demons, a barbarian race with no honor or respect for life. The Japanese military, in its relentless propaganda, had hammered this message home again and again. Death, they were told, was a better option than falling into the hands of these monsters. As the American invasion became an inevitability, the atmosphere on the island grew charged with a terrifying energy. The soldiers, once a reassuring presence, became nervous and frantic. The quiet villages were transformed into scenes of desperate preparation. The civilians were given rudimentary training in guerrilla warfare, taught how to use sharpened bamboo sticks as spears, and instructed to kill themselves rather than be captured. The military distributed hand grenades and suicide pills. The message was clear and chilling: if they land, your fate is sealed. Die with honor. Kiyomi and Hana clung to each other in their small hut, the sounds of American naval bombardment growing louder and closer each day. The ground trembled with the force of the explosions. The sky, once a brilliant azure, was now a canvas of black smoke and angry fire. The world was ending, just as the propagandists had promised. The whispers of the villagers, once of harvest and weather, now centered on the best ways to end one's life. Some planned to throw themselves off the cliffs of Marpi Point, a high promontory on the northern tip of the island, a place that would soon become a mass grave for thousands. One afternoon, as the shelling intensified, a young soldier burst into their hut, his face gaunt with fear. He thrust a small bag into Kiyomi's hands. "Take this," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It is what you will need." Do not falter. Do not shame us. Inside the bag were 2 hand grenades. Kiyomi looked at the crude iron spheres, their surfaces cold and rough beneath her fingertips. This was her final duty. This was the ultimate act of loyalty. She looked at Hana, her younger sister, her face pale and etched with terror. She could not do it. She could not kill her own sister. She could not kill herself. The sounds of battle were now right outside their door. Screaming filled the air, the frantic shouts of soldiers, and the terrified cries of civilians. A shadow fell across the entrance to their hut. Kiyomi instinctively clutched the grenades, her knuckles white. An American soldier stood there, a towering figure in a green uniform, his rifle held loosely in his hands. He was not a demon. He was just a man. He spoke to them, his words foreign and incomprehensible. His voice was not angry. It was calm, almost pleading. He gestured to them, beckoning them to come out. For a moment, Kiyomi's entire worldview collapsed. Everything she had been taught, everything she had been told, was a lie. This man was not a monster. He was not a demon. He was offering them something. What was it? Relief? A chance at life? The military had told them that the Americans would torture and rape them before killing them. Yet this man's eyes held no malice, only a strange, tired compassion. He held out his hand. Hana, trembling, took a small step forward. This was it. The moment of truth. Kiyomi's hand instinctively tightened around the grenades. Her entire life had been a preparation for this moment. Duty, honor, death. But what about life? The soldier spoke again, his voice gentle. He was offering them water. He held up a canteen. It was a simple, mundane act, but to Kiyomi, it was a revelation. It was the first act of humanity she had seen in weeks. A tiny crack appeared in the wall of propaganda that had been built around her mind, and in that crack, a sliver of hope. The soldier led them away from the wreckage, past the charred remnants of their village, and toward a large open field where hundreds of other Japanese civilians were being gathered. The scene was chaotic and heartbreaking, a tapestry of fear and despair. Yet, as Kiyomi looked at the faces around her, she saw not only terror but also a dawning recognition. They were all alive. They had all, in their own way, chosen to defy the military's orders. They had chosen life. This was their first step toward a new reality. They were no longer soldiers of the emperor, but simply survivors. They were being led to a new place, a place of captivity, of confinement, of the unknown. And yet, for the first time in months, they felt a strange, fragile sense of peace. The bombing had stopped. The screaming had subsided. They were alive. But what would their new life be like? What horrors awaited them in these American camps? And what would happen when the world they had known, a world of imperial propaganda and rigid social order, was replaced by something completely alien, something utterly beyond their comprehension? Of a military truck rumbling over a gravel road. The engine groans and hisses. Visuals. A low-angle shot of the truck's tires kicking up dust. Inside the truck, the faces of the Japanese women are a study in contrasts. Some are blank with shock. Others are etched with weary suspicion. Kiyomi and Hana sit huddled together, their eyes wide and cautious. The journey to the camp was a jarring, uncomfortable ride. The truck, a massive, unyielding beast of metal and canvas, bounced and lurched, its every movement a cruel reminder of their powerlessness. The women sat in silence, their thoughts a cacophony of fear and uncertainty. They passed the skeletal remains of buildings, the twisted steel of destroyed vehicles, and the silent, grim figures of Japanese soldiers who had fallen in battle. Each sight was a new wound, a fresh reminder of their defeat. They were no longer the proud citizens of a divine empire. They were simply the vanquished, a flock of lost souls herded by their conquerors. As the truck came to a stop, they were told to disembark. They stepped out into a clearing, their feet sinking into the soft dirt. Before them stood a sprawling collection of low, wooden barracks surrounded by a high fence of barbed wire. A guard tower manned by an American soldier loomed over the entire scene. This was their new home. This was the place where the Americans would carry out the atrocities they had been promised. The women braced themselves, their hearts thumping in their chests. They were ready for the hunger, the beatings, the humiliation. They were ready for the worst. But the reality that unfolded was nothing like the nightmare they had been led to expect. The first shock came from the sheer scale of the operation. There were hundreds of other women and children, a tide of humanity that filled the open space. The American soldiers, a diverse group of young men from different walks of life, moved among them with a strange, business-like efficiency. They were not cruel. They were not screaming or shouting orders. They were simply doing their job. A group of female American nurses, dressed in crisp white uniforms, moved among the women, offering them cups of water and small biscuits. The biscuits were a revelation. They were a simple, hard food, but to the starving women who had lived on rations of boiled rice and meager vegetables for months, they were a feast. The taste was sweet and foreign. Hannah, her eyes wide with a childlike wonder, held a biscuit in her hand as if it were a precious jewel. Kiyomi watched her sister, a small smile forming on her lips. This was not the welcome of a demon. This was the welcome of a human being. They were led to their barracks, a long, Spartan building with a single row of cots on either side. Each cot was covered with a clean, rough blanket. The air inside the barracks was dry and smelled of fresh-cut pine. A small kerosene lamp sat on a table in the center of the room. It was not a palace, but it was a place of safety. It was clean. It was dry. After months of living in holes in the ground, of sleeping in the mud, this simple structure felt like a luxurious home. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. The next day, after a simple breakfast of oatmeal and bread, the women were given their first proper meal. They were led to a large mess hall, a long wooden building filled with tables and benches. The American cooks, a burly, cheerful group, served them a meal that was so abundant and rich it felt like a dream. There was rice, yes, but there was also meat, a thick stew of beef and vegetables. And there were potatoes and fresh bread and even a slice of something sweet for dessert. The women ate in stunned silence, their eyes darting from plate to plate, as if afraid the food would vanish before their eyes. The rich taste of the beef, a flavor they had not experienced in years, was almost overwhelming. They had been told the Americans were a race of savages who would starve them, but here they were, being fed better than they had been in years. Kiyomi watched an elderly woman at a nearby table, her face a mask of disbelief. The woman, her hands gnarled and frail, picked up a piece of meat and held it up to her eyes, as if to confirm that it was real. Tears streamed down her wrinkled cheeks. "It is a dream," she whispered to her companion. "This must be a dream." But it was not a dream. It was the new reality. The camp was not a place of torture. It was a place of comfort. The days that followed were a series of such stunning revelations. They were given clean clothes, a simple uniform of a long dress and a blouse, but they were clean and new. They were given soap and clean water to wash. The American nurses provided medical care, tending to their wounds, treating their illnesses, and offering them kindness. Kiyomi, who had a persistent fever, was given medicine that brought her temperature down. The nurses spoke to her in broken Japanese, their words simple but their meaning clear. "You are safe," they said. "We will help you." The camp was not a prison in the way they had understood the word. The barbed wire was there, a constant reminder of their captivity, but within its confines they were free to move about. The American guards, far from being cruel taskmasters, were largely indifferent. They were young men, many of them not much older than Kiyomi herself, and they seemed more bored than hostile. They would stand guard, their faces impassive, their rifles slung over their shoulders, but they never raised a hand to the women. One afternoon, as Kiyomi was helping to hang laundry on a clothesline, she saw a small group of children playing a game of catch with an American soldier. The soldier, a tall, lanky man with a kind smile, was laughing as a small Japanese boy, no older than 5, chased a ball he had thrown. The sight was so utterly incongruous with everything she had been taught that it left her breathless. The soldier, the supposed demon, was playing with a child he should have been treating with contempt. This was not war. This was not the enemy. This was something else entirely. It was a world turned upside down. As the days turned into weeks, the women began to feel a sense of security they had not known in years. The constant fear, the gnawing hunger, the ever-present threat of violence, all of it began to recede, replaced by a strange sense of calm. They began to talk, to share their stories, to laugh. They began to rebuild a sense of community. The camp was a world of its own, a tiny pocket of peace in the midst of a global war. But this new reality, this paradise, was not without its challenges. It was a life of stultifying monotony, a life of endless routine. There was a nagging sense of shame, of having been captured, of having failed in their duty to die. And there was the constant gnawing question, what would happen to them when the war was over? Would this new life, this incredible, unbelievable reality simply disappear? And what about the men? Where were the fathers, the brothers, the husbands who had gone to fight for the emperor? Would they ever see them again? Of a small group of women singing a traditional Japanese folk song. The voices are soft and melancholic. Visuals. A group of Japanese women sitting in a circle on the ground in the camp courtyard. They are engaged in a craft, perhaps weaving or sewing. The camera focuses on the quiet, determined hands of Kiyomi as she works. Life in the camp settled into a predictable rhythm, a tapestry of routine woven from simple daily tasks. The mornings began with the quiet stirrings of the women, the rustle of blankets, and the soft whispers of conversation. They would gather for a simple breakfast, a meal that, while not extravagant, was always filling and nutritious. The days were spent in a variety of activities designed to keep them occupied and to maintain a sense of normalcy. Some of the women, like Kiyomi, helped with teaching the children, setting up a makeshift school in one of the barracks. They used what they could find, scraps of paper, charcoal from burnt wood, to teach the children to read and write. For Kiyomi, this was an act of quiet defiance, a way of preserving the culture and the language that had defined their lives. Others took to various crafts, using whatever materials were available. They wove baskets from dried grasses, made dolls from salvaged cloth, and mended their clothes with meticulous care. These activities were more than just a way to pass the time. They were a way of reclaiming their dignity, of reminding themselves that they were still human beings with skills and purpose. They were also a way of coping with the immense trauma they had endured. The memories of Saipan, of the bombs and the screaming and the desperate flight, were never far from their minds. But here, in this strange safe haven, they could begin to process the pain. They could talk about their losses, their fears, and their hopes for the future. The American authorities, for their part, seemed to understand the need for these activities. They provided what they could, often looking the other way as the women scavenged for materials. A young American corporal, a quiet man named Thomas, would sometimes bring them scraps of wood or metal he had found, and he would watch, a small, curious smile on his face, as the women transformed these useless objects into things of beauty. He was not a savior. He was just a man. But his small acts of kindness were a source of immeasurable comfort. One afternoon, as Kiyomi was teaching a group of children, a jeep rumbled to a stop outside the barracks. An American officer, a stern-faced man in a crisp uniform, stepped out, followed by a smaller man, a Japanese-American interpreter. The women and children fell silent, their eyes wide with apprehension. The officer held up a large piece of paper. The interpreter spoke, his voice clear and formal, but with an underlying hint of sympathy. "This is a list," he said. "A list of Japanese civilians who have been captured. We are trying to reunite families." A murmur went through the crowd. This was something they had not dared to hope for, a chance to find their loved ones. The officer began to read the names, his voice a monotonous drone. The women listened intently, their hearts in their throats. The list was long, and for most, it brought only disappointment. Name after name was read, and no one from their village, no one they knew was on it. Kiyomi's hands trembled. What if her parents had been captured? What if they were on a different island? What if they were gone? The possibility was a cold, hard stone in her chest. Then the interpreter said a name that made her freeze. Sato Hana. It was her sister's name. Kiyomi's head snapped up. "Is she here?" the interpreter asked, looking directly at Kiyomi. "Yes," Kiyomi said, her voice a whisper. Hana, who had been standing beside her, took a step forward. The interpreter nodded. He read another name. "Sato Kiyomi." Another knot in her chest loosened. They had found them. They had been found. But the list was not for them. It was for a different group. It was a cruel tease. A brief, tantalizing glimpse of a hope that was not meant for them. The officer finished reading the names and the jeep rumbled away, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than before. The brief spark of hope had been extinguished, leaving a feeling of profound loneliness. But then, a few days later, a new group of prisoners arrived. They were from a different island, a place called Guam. They were a mix of men, women, and children. As the new arrivals were being led to their barracks, Kiyomi saw a young boy, no older than her own students, his face smeared with dirt, his eyes wide with fear. And then, standing behind him, she saw a woman she knew. It was Mrs. Tanaka, a kind, elderly woman who had been their neighbor on Saipan. Mrs. Tanaka, her face a mask of shock, saw Kiyomi and Hana. A small cry escaped her lips. "Kiyomi-san," she called out, her voice cracked with emotion. "Hana-chan!" They ran toward each other, their embrace a silent symphony of relief and joy. Mrs. Tanaka had believed they were dead. She had seen their village destroyed, and she had assumed the worst. "How did you get here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Kiyomi told her their story, of the kind soldier, of the journey, of the incredible, unbelievable comfort of the camp. Mrs. Tanaka listened, her eyes welling with tears. "We thought we were alone," she said. "We thought we were the only ones. They told us the Americans would kill us." But Mrs. Tanaka had a story of her own. She had been separated from her husband, a fisherman named Kenji. He had been captured on a different part of the island and had been taken to a different camp. The American officers had told her that he was safe, that he was being treated well. She didn't believe them. But now, seeing Kiyomi and Hana, she felt a flicker of hope. What if it was true? What if the men were safe, too? The presence of the new arrivals changed the dynamic of the camp. It was no longer a small, isolated group of women, but a small, growing community. They had new faces, new stories, and new hope. But with this new hope came a fresh wave of fear. The war was still raging, and they were still prisoners. They were still at the mercy of their captors. And what if their new life, this strange and beautiful paradise, was just a temporary illusion? What if the reality of war, the hunger, the violence, and the death, was simply waiting for them on the other side of the barbed wire fence? What if this idyllic existence was merely a prelude to a far more terrible fate and a return to the brutality they had just escaped? Of a soft rain beginning to fall, pattering on the tin roof of the barracks. The sound is gentle, almost soothing. Visuals. A shot from inside the barracks, looking out through a small, grimy window. The rain creates beautiful, distorted patterns on the glass. As the monsoon season descended upon the camp, life took on a different rhythm. The days were filled with the constant, gentle drumming of rain on the roofs, a sound that lulled the women into a state of quiet contemplation. The outside world, the world of war and destruction, seemed to fade away, replaced by the hushed, intimate world of the barracks. It was a time for reflection, for sharing stories, and for the slow, painful process of healing. The new arrivals, the women from Guam, brought with them a different perspective, a different set of experiences. They had also been told to kill themselves, to fight to the last breath, and they too had defied the orders of their military leaders. One evening, as the rain poured down, a group of women gathered in Kiyomi's barracks. Mrs. Tanaka, her face a serene mask in the lamplight, spoke of the final days on Guam. She described the terrible chaos, the desperate flight, and the heartbreaking moment she was separated from her husband. "He told me to run," she said, her voice soft and heavy with grief. "He told me to take the boy and run. I never saw him again." The women listened in silence. They all had similar stories, tales of loss and separation, of loved ones who had been left behind, who had been swallowed by the monstrous maw of war. But here in the safety of the camp, they could speak of these things without fear. They could share their grief, and in sharing they found a strange and beautiful sense of solidarity. They were no longer alone in their suffering. They were a community of survivors, a sisterhood of loss. The Americans, too, began to show a different, more human side. The camp was not just a place of confinement, it was a place of exchange. The American soldiers, many of them young and far from home, would often come to the fence, curious about the women and their children. They would stand there, their hands in their pockets, and try to make conversation, using gestures and the few Japanese words they had learned. The women at first were suspicious, their ingrained fear of the enemy still a powerful force, but gradually a tentative trust began to form. One day, a young soldier named Corporal Smith brought a small, hand-carved wooden bird to the fence. He handed it to one of the children, a little girl with large, frightened eyes. The girl's mother, her hands trembling, took the bird and held it up to the light. It was crudely made, but it was beautiful, a small, fragile thing of peace. The girl, her fear replaced by a shy curiosity, looked at the soldier and gave him a small, hesitant smile. It was a small, almost insignificant moment, but it was a bridge, a tiny connection between two worlds that had been at war for years. These small acts of kindness were a powerful counterpoint to the endless propaganda the women had been fed. They had been told the Americans were monsters, but the faces they saw, the hands that offered them food, the voices that spoke to them with respect, were not the faces of monsters. They were the faces of ordinary people, of fathers and sons, of human beings. Kiyomi, in her role as a teacher, found a new sense of purpose. She taught not only the children but the other women as well. She taught them to read and write, to do simple arithmetic. She taught them poetry and history, the stories of their own culture. It was a way of resisting the erasure of their identity. They were in an American camp, but they were still Japanese. Their culture, their history, and their dignity were things that could not be taken from them. And the Americans, to their surprise, not only allowed this, but actively encouraged it. The camp director, a kind and pragmatic man named Colonel Johnson, came to her one day. He spoke to her through an interpreter, his voice low and respectful. "I want to help you," he said. "Your people need to feel that they are not just prisoners. They need to feel that they are a community." He provided them with more supplies, paper, pens, even a few books that had been salvaged from the battlefield. He was not an enemy. He was a caretaker. The camp, which had once felt like a prison, now began to feel more like a home. It was a place of safety, of comfort, of community. But even as this new life unfolded, a deep unease lingered. The war was still raging in the outside world, a distant, ominous roar. And the Japanese military, their own people, were still fighting, still holding to the belief that surrender was a disgrace, that death was a better option. What would happen to them when the war was over? Would they be released back into a world that saw them as traitors? Would the soldiers, their own countrymen, see them as a source of shame? And what would their life be like in a new world that they had helped to create, but that was a world away from the one they had known? Their sense of belonging was fragile, built on the shifting sands of war. And with each passing day, the question of their future became more and more pressing, a looming uncertainty that overshadowed their peaceful existence, a question for which there seemed to be no answer. Of a radio broadcast, a crackling mix of static and a man's voice speaking in English. The voice is formal, clipped, and full of gravity. Visuals, the women huddled together around a small battery-powered radio. Their faces are a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The radio was a new addition to the camp, a small black box that sat on a table in the center of the mess hall. It was a window to the outside world, a world of battlefields and politics and a war that was still raging. The women would gather around it each day, their ears straining to understand the garbled English, their minds trying to make sense of the news. An interpreter would translate the major points, but the details, the nuances, were often lost. They heard of battles in the Philippines, of fierce fighting on Okinawa, of the relentless advance of the American forces. The news was both a source of dread and of a strange, guilty relief. With each new American victory, the war was closer to ending. And with each new American victory, the threat of them being sent back to the front lines, back to the battle, receded. Then came the news that sent a shiver through the entire camp. The interpreter, his face pale, announced that the Americans had dropped a new kind of bomb on a Japanese city. He called it an atomic bomb. He struggled to explain what it was, but the words he used, unimaginable destruction, a single bomb that could destroy an entire city, filled the women with a profound sense of dread. Was this what their military had been fighting against? This kind of power? This kind of devastation? It was a force of nature, a thing of pure terror. Days passed, and the news became more and more frequent. The Americans had dropped a second bomb on another city. And then, the news they had all been waiting for. The news they had all dreaded. The news that would change their lives forever. The Emperor had surrendered. The war was over. The women sat in stunned silence, their hands still, their eyes wide. The war that had defined their entire lives, the war that had taken their homes and their families, was finally over. The feeling was not one of triumph, but of a profound and overwhelming sadness. The defeat was a crushing blow, a shame that settled on them like a heavy shroud. But beneath the shame, a small, fragile sense of hope began to bloom. They were alive. They had survived. The days and weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The camp, once a place of quiet routine, was now a place of transition. The American authorities began the process of repatriation. The women were told they would be going home. But what was home? Was it the shattered, ruined country they had left behind? A place where they would be seen as traitors, as failures? The thought was terrifying. They had found a strange, paradoxical sense of belonging in the camp, a place where they were neither Japanese nor American, but simply survivors. Now they were being sent back to a world that would see them as something else entirely. One afternoon, a group of Japanese men, a mix of civilians and soldiers, were brought to the camp. They were gaunt and thin, their faces etched with the kind of suffering the women had escaped. They had been fighting in the jungles of Saipan, starving, desperate, and they had believed the propaganda to the bitter end. When they saw the women, their first reaction was not one of joy, but of a cold, harsh disbelief. They saw the women dressed in their clean, simple clothes, their faces healthy and well-fed, and they were filled with a profound sense of betrayal. They had been told the women would be tortured and killed. They had been told the Americans were monsters. And here they were, living in what looked like a paradise. One of the soldiers, a young man with a hollow look in his eyes, pointed a trembling finger at Kiyomi. "You are a traitor," he hissed. "You have shamed us all. You should have died." Kiyomi, her heart pounding, stood her ground. "We did not choose this," she said, her voice firm. "We chose to live." The soldier was not listening. His eyes were filled with a burning, terrible anger. The camp, which had been a haven of peace, was now a place of conflict, a collision between two incompatible realities. The women had made a difficult choice, a choice to live, to survive, to defy the imperial order. The men had made a different choice, a choice to fight, to suffer, and to die. And now, in this small, confined space, their two worlds had collided. The men saw the women as weak, as having betrayed their nation. The women saw the men as victims of a terrible lie. The American guards, sensing the tension, intervened. They separated the groups, putting the men in a different section of the camp. But the damage had been done. The women, who had found a new sense of community and purpose, were now faced with the judgment of their own people. The men, who had fought for the glory of the Emperor, were now faced with the crushing reality of their defeat and the shameful survival of those they had been told to protect. The paradise they had found was now under threat. The future was not one of simple reunion, but of a profound and painful reconciliation with their own culture, their own people, and their own history. The women had found salvation in the hands of their enemies, but now they were faced with the possibility of being rejected by their own countrymen. What would their lives be like, caught between the two worlds they now inhabited, a place of peace they had found in captivity and a place of shame they were about to return to? Of a boat horn, a low, mournful sound that echoes across the water. Visuals. A shot of the women and children, now in a large group, standing on a dock. The sun is setting, casting a long golden light on their faces. The camera pans across their faces, a mix of hope and apprehension. The day of departure arrived with the dawn, a cool, quiet morning filled with the salty tang of the sea. The women and children, now dressed in a mix of their old clothes and the simple uniforms they had been given, were led to the docks. A large American transport ship, a gray utilitarian vessel, sat anchored in the harbor, its hull a dark shadow against the pale morning sky. The journey home, the American officers had explained, would be long and arduous, but it would take them back to Japan, back to the world they had left behind. As they walked, Kiyomi looked around at the camp one last time. It was a place that had, by all accounts, saved their lives. It was a place of paradox, a prison that had been a paradise. It had been a place of quiet dignity, of small acts of kindness, of human connection in the midst of a terrible war. It was the place where they had learned to live again. The barbed wire, once a symbol of their captivity, now seemed to stand for something else. The fragile line between the past and the future, between the world they had left and the world they were about to enter. On the dock, the women and men were separated into different lines. The men, the emaciated survivors of the jungle, still looked at the women with a mixture of suspicion and scorn. They had been told that a soldier's honor lay in death, and they saw in the women's survival a profound betrayal of that ideal. Kiyomi saw the young soldier who had called her a traitor. He was gaunt and silent, his eyes fixed on the ground. She knew his story, the story of a man who had been lied to, who had been told that his only duty was to die for his country. She felt a profound sense of pity for him and a strange, unexpected sense of gratitude. She had been lucky. She had been given a choice. He had not. As she walked up the gangplank, a voice called out to her. It was Corporal Smith, the young American soldier who had brought the wooden bird to the little girl. He stood at the edge of the dock, his hands in his pockets, his face a mix of sadness and relief. "Kiyomi-san," he said, his voice quiet. He held out his hand. In it was a small, crudely carved object. It was a replica of the small wooden bird he had given to the little girl. "For you," he said. Kiyomi took the bird, its surface smooth and cool under her fingertips. She looked at him, and for a moment, a lifetime of unspoken words passed between them. It was a small, fragile act of peace, a tiny testament to the human connection that had been forged in this strange, improbable place. As the ship pulled away from the dock, the women and children stood at the rail, watching the island recede into a small green speck on the horizon. The camp, the barbed wire, the guard towers, all of it disappeared into the distance. They were going home. But what would they find there? The men on the ship, their fellow countrymen, were a living embodiment of the struggle they were about to face. They were returning to a shattered, defeated country, a country that had been told that surrender was a disgrace. They were survivors of a different kind of war, a war of ideas, of propaganda, of the very essence of what it meant to be human. They had found sanctuary in the hands of their enemies. Now they were returning to their own people, and they would have to find a way to reconcile their own salvation with the great tragedy of their nation. The ship cut through the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Kiyomi stood at the bow, the small wooden bird clutched in her hand. The future was a great unknown ocean, but she was no longer a prisoner. She was a survivor. She was a woman who had chosen to live. And she would carry the memory of this place, this paradox, this paradise with her. The world had told her to die with honor, but she had chosen to live with grace. The journey was just beginning. The true test of their survival, the real battle for their humanity, was still ahead of them, in the heart of a broken nation. The paradise they had known was gone, but the lessons they had learned within its confines were just beginning to be put to the test. Lessons they would have to live out in a world that had not yet learned to reconcile with its own defeat.